All right, welcome back, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual audience for our next panel here at the 2024 Veterans Advanced Energy Summit, Securing Energy Resources, the Role of Defense Planning in Protecting Energy Supply Chains. My name's Reed Blakemore with the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center, and it's a thrill to do this session because it touches on an issue that is close to my heart, but also critical to all of the conversations we're going to be having today. I think as our first three sessions, frankly, articulated, national security is a function of energy security, which is a function of logistics, which is a function of value and supply chains, right? So if we take that lesson forward and understand that we're in a moment of energy transition where our resource base is expanding dramatically. The resource needs we need for energy, but also for the global economy is diversifying and causing new supply side constraints that we need to address if we want that transition or that economic future to be secure, but also, frankly, not inflationary, because the more of this stuff we need, the more it's going to cost over the long term. But then finally, a third point I think that's worth drawing into this conversation is something Landon expressed in a previous session, which is as our demands on componentry, as our demands on supply chains increase, how do we think through the new security needs and demands associated with vulnerabilities that may be on the horizon as those technologies begin to permeate our economic and national security? So to that end, it's my pleasure to be joined by four panelists who we can have a robust conversation with on the subject. Dr. Morgan Bazilian, the director of the Payne Institute and professor of public policy at the Colorado School of Mines. Dr. Danielle Merfeld, Global Chief Technology Officer at Hanwha QCells. Julia Sicardo, Director of the Office of Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains at the U.S. Department of Energy, and Vice Admiral John Miller, Chief Executive Officer at VX Marine, founder, president, and CEO of the Fawzi Miller Group, and also, importantly, a former commander of U.S. Naval Forces, the Central Command of the U.S. Fifth Fleet. Thank you all for joining us. To frame the conversation a bit, I'm going to throw out four discussion questions that I think should be the core challenge that we're trying to answer as we go through our discussion today. One, as energy supply chains become more complex and vulnerable due to global conflicts and geopolitical shifts, how should U.S. defense planning evolve to ensure the security and resilience of critical energy resources? What new regions, or question two, what regions or choke points are emerging as strategic priorities for U.S. defense efforts as we think about transforming global energy flows? Three, with the energy transition increasing demand for critical minerals, how can the U.S. and its allies mitigate supply chain risk, and what role should the Department of Defense play in that? And four, how have recent conflicts, such as the war in Ukraine, tensions in the Middle East, heightened our sense of the vulnerabilities in these supply chains? So those four questions in mind, Morgan, I might start with you, because I think I want to start with the resource base and work our way up to these big strategic questions. Can you elaborate a little bit on the critical need for improved U.S. supply chains for rare and critical minerals in particular? And also, what are the solution sets that you think we have available to us to address those needs?
Thanks, Reed, and thanks for the Atlantic Council and the Veterans Advanced Energy Project for having me here. I would say that the Veterans Advanced Energy Project has been a real thrill to work with and important, and I've engaged since its inception. Look, Reed, that's a big set of questions. The Vice Admiral can speak much more coherently than I can about what's happened with the Fifth Fleet and why the Fifth Fleet went to where it went initially. And I think, so it's Jimmy Carter's, 100th birthday yesterday. That Carter Doctrine and the energy policies that came during his presidency have set energy security policies since that time. And they've mostly been supply side focused. So your question was on the supply side. They've mostly been supply side focused, right? We send the Fifth Fleet to the Strait of Hormuz and we protect the supply. And so now we're in this paradigm where a lot of people are thinking about the different metals and minerals and materials that we need for society. And the focus is again on the supply side. So when we calculate, which is a very simple calculation, what's on that critical minerals list from the USGS, it's all supply side focus. It's where it comes from, but since the Carter Doctrine and since the late 70s, our understanding of energy security has become much more sophisticated. And so I think we need to move some of that sophistication into the critical minerals thinking. So we know that there are rocks in the ground that have important metals in them, and we roughly know where those things are, but no one needs rocks. And so what you need is either chemicals or metals from those rocks. And so when we're thinking through this problem, if you don't think through the supply chain security issues, the trade implications, the market implications related to inflation or whatever, then you're missing most of the picture. And so I'll just say that we've created this priority in government, and Julia and her team are doing an amazing job at it. And others across the government, we've created this tension with China as the not just the elephant in the room, but the enemy in this critical minerals space. And while they do dominate, using that popular phrase now, this space, not just at the supply side, but all the way through the supply chain through to advanced manufacturing, how we fight them, or how we get through these trade wars, or how we look at the economic security, will likely have a bigger set of implications for the United States than it will for China. And so I think we have to thoughtfully think through, only to go back to your original question, just thinking from a supply side is myopic, and we will get the wrong answers by doing it. And Danielle next to me, any photovoltaic manufacturer can see that, those set of issues very clearly, and it's probably the best analogy for this space, and we can get into that later. I'll stop there.
Danielle, I think it's a natural opportunity to turn to you as we move kind of up the value chain of some of these things. One of the kind of instincts associated with supply chain security is to localize and reshore, and that's reshoring, friendshoring has become a rhetorical device we've heard more and more frequently here in DC in recent years. Can you walk us through a bit, kind of what are the benefits of thinking through reshoring, particularly given some of the challenges that we've seen with regard to reliance on foreign suppliers? And particularly, I think we'd be interested in learning, your experience at QCells. What are you doing, and how are you thinking through your own supply chains to ensure the resiliency of your value chains?
Thanks, Reed. That's a great question, and I also just want to start by thanking the Atlantic Council for having me here. This is a very important topic around supply chains generally, and specifically for solar. It might be helpful for me to give everyone just a grounding in where we are, not because you don't have your finger on the pulse of solar, but because things are changing so fast. Unless you're in the mix, you'll blink and it's different. So just to catch us up, solar is the fastest growing energy resource on the planet in terms of installs every year. That's because it's also the lowest cost in almost every region of the planet where people live, and it's accessible everywhere people live. And what that's done is, it's here in the US, it's created a dynamic where not only is solar our fastest growing energy resource, it's also more than half of the energy installations every year. So last year was the first year that we crossed 50% for solar. It's very, very typical in other countries as well. And it's also feeding the fastest growing jobs market out of all the different jobs sectors in the US. So it's a pretty important part of our economy, not just our energy network. And part of that is driven by low costs. And I will say the elephant in the room, as Morgan already mentioned, is China. So China has had a very deliberate and very transparent industrial policy now for more than almost 2 decades. But in the last decade, it's become quite more visible and transparent to us that they are using certain aspects of trade, like solar, EV, battery, to become dominant politically, economically, technically around the world. And it's working. 80% of solar panels around the world are made in or by companies controlled by China or funded by China. And if you go up the value chain a bit more, let's say you go to the wafers that are made into solar cells, which are put into modules, 99% of the world's wafers are made by companies controlled by China. Top 10 companies that make solar equipment are Chinese companies. So if you think about a country like ours that has a growing demand for low-cost energy that's distributed and can help us withstand cyber issues, national security issues, or even climate issues, to have that is something will be very important for us. And by 2050, it's estimated that to reach our climate goals, 50% of our energy in this country will come from solar. So we can't be too careless about how we set up the access to that resource. So back to the question of what is my company, QCells, what are we doing about it, and how have we partnered with our customers and the government here in the US, is we've expanded our footprint manufacturing-wise, and actually we're building, for the first time outside of China, an end-to-end full supply chain suite for silicon-based solar manufacturing here in the US. It's just outside Atlanta, 3.3 gigawatts of ingot, wafer, cell, and module, all under one roof. That will help provide this domestic capability. Frankly, it will bring back domestic manufacturing in a way that not just helps with these pinch points and supply challenges, but also creates a learning lab for us to create and utilize more resources domestically from a talent pool perspective. We can innovate the next generation of technology that will come from this because we effectively are doing the work. So this investment is, I think you can look at it from so many different dimensions of sort of an energy security angle, but also an economic development angle and a talent and workforce development angle. Mm-hmm. And this is in the mix. The wafer or the module part is up and running already. The wafer and ingot pieces will be up this year, and the cell part at the end of the year, in the first quarter of next year. And it'll be very exciting to see how this works and to see how we can start to build, once again in the US, this solar competency that today is dominated outside.
You mentioned that part of this is private sector led, but policy has a huge part of this. And Julia, I think I'll turn to you to help us think through a little bit of what is the U.S. government doing to both enable companies like Hanwha QCells to participate in domestically resource supply chains, domestic manufacturing, et cetera. But also there's an important role for partners and allies in this conversation. So a two-part question for you, really. One, how are you at DOE approaching this issue of supply chain security? And then how are you balancing the necessary interaction between what you need to have domestically versus what you should be relying on partners and allies for?
Thank you, Reid, for the question. And first off, thank you so much to the Atlantic Council, and particularly special for me to be here. My husband is an active duty Green Beret, and so it is an honor to get to address this group on this topic. I'll back up a little bit and share our mission as the Manufacturing and Energy Supply Chains Office at DOE. And I will first note we are a new office. We're a startup within DOE. We have been around for a sum total of about 2 years. And our mission is energy security and supply chain security. And so we tackle that very important mission by working very closely with the private sector to enable the deployment of capital into these particularly important energy verticals. We, over the past many decades, have really had a decline in manufacturing in the U.S., a deindustrialization of our U.S. economy, and that has not only led to a lot of jobs being shipped overseas, it has brought our energy supply chains to a precarious state. Where investments on behalf of industrial policies of other nations leave us quite vulnerable in very important segments of the supply chain, not only at the energy product level. So the way that we're structured at the MESC office is around 3 pillars. One, we're investing in manufacturing capacity across clean energy products. We start from critical minerals processing and go all the way up through to finished products, whether they be solar panels, batteries, cars, and the like, and everything in between. And our focus there is on partnering with providers of private capital to stand up manufacturing facilities. Because we have not been investing in manufacturing in the US for such a long time, there's a lot of risk associated with these projects. And when we're talking about a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar gigascale manufacturing facility, the private sector, even established infrastructure funds, can be reticent to move forward with that kind of project in the US. So what we do is we come forward and invest at the project level and bring capital to the tune of $100 million or sometimes more to be able to de-risk these projects and enable them to go forward. We're on track right now to deploy about $20 billion of capital, largely through these project level grants, by the end of this year. And that has catalyzed a much broader amount of private capital. Just 2 weeks ago, we announced a series of grants focused on the critical minerals and battery manufacturing space. And that was $3 billion on behalf of the government, but in total it was a $10 billion public-private capital volume that was announced in across 25 different projects in this battery manufacturing space. And so I think that really represents our philosophy around the role that government can play in reshoring these energy supply chains, which is to enable, but really have the private sector to lead, to bring forward these projects. They can't be fully bankrolled and pushed forward by the government. There needs to be that demand pull, and there needs to be private sector financing that is also coming forward. Our second building block, which is really important and hopefully we'll have a chance to chat more about, is around workforce and ensuring that we also have the manufacturing workforce, the operating workforce in these clean energy sectors. There is a huge need for new jobs and more training. Every year we need to be adding over 80,000 electricians just to keep pace with our workforce needs. And we are partnering with skilling institutions, from four-year institutions to vocational schools and community colleges, to fund programs to increase more training in this facility, in this area. We've got 150 different training facilities that we're partnered with across the US, and we're looking to add more. And then importantly, our third building block is really around analysis. We take apart supply chains going all the way up to their critical minerals components and understand where those choke points are. And that informs not only where we're investing the dollars that we have, but also how we're thinking about new policy needs, how we're thinking about sharing information with the private sector where there may be important investment opportunities that can go forward without public support. And that really underpins a lot of our work with the National Security Council and also with colleagues at DoD.
That's fantastic answer, and I'm glad you touched on workforce because it's a continued thread that keeps popping up in the conversations today. Before I turn to Vice Admiral Miller, I do want to remind everyone, as we are starting to get questions in the chat, please use askac.org if you would like to ask a question. I'll begin working those into our conversation shortly. But first, Vice Admiral Miller, I'd like to turn to you to kind of bring us back out to this strategic picture. Ultimately, when we're talking about supply chain risk, the interest in reshoring, nearshoring, allied shoring, we're talking about the security risk associated with getting stuff from point A to point B. And that's both a problem of the energy transition we're conducting right now, but also has been a long-standing problem associated with fuel supply chains. And the reason why we've cared about the Strait of Hormuz for so long is because these value chains for our energy system have been long and extended and warranted the attention of strategic planners in the defense community in particular. I would ask you to reflect a little bit, given your firsthand experience at Central Command. Walk us through the importance of strategic choke points. How are we thinking about them now with regard to Houthi attacks on cargo ships in the Red Sea, et cetera? But how should we be thinking about them in an over-the-horizon setting as energy transition changes our resource flows, our manufacturing flows, et cetera?
Thanks, Reed, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for having me. Julia, thanks to you and your husband for your service. We're entirely grateful for it. So let me start with just talking about what's the purpose of the Navy, and it's codified in Title 10 of the U.S. Code. And it says that in peacetime, the Navy is charged with being organized, trained, and equipped in order to contribute to the national defense and the security of the United States, and to ensure economic prosperity. So we know right from the beginning that guarding sea lanes of communication, which connect the choke points of the world, and ensuring the free flow of commerce through those choke points is critically important, and a Navy mission. There are 6 big choke points in the world, maritime choke points. There are more, and I'll talk about a couple of them, but there are 6 currently, and it's Gibraltar, Suez, Bab el-Mandeb at the southern end of the Red Sea, Strait of Malacca, which connects the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and the Panama Canal. In 2021, motor vessel Evergreen was transiting the Suez Canal. They had an accident, and they got stuck in the canal. They were stuck for nearly a week. And it could have been terrorism. It could have been operator error. Turns out it was operator error. But that closed the Suez Canal for almost a week. The cost of that to the global economy was $400 million an hour. And so we can see how just one choke point being cut off can have a significant impact on what's happening. Looking at what's going on today, we look at what the Houthis are doing, and the Suez and Bab el-Mandeb at either end of the Red Sea are really interesting to me because it's a pipe that connects different bodies of water. And if you clog up one end of the pipe, the Suez, we see what happens. If you clog up the other end, you have a similar sort of outcome. And so it's important that all of them are kept free, open, and clear. And that is a U.S. Navy mission. A number of our friends and allies have that same mission, and we work with them, and we're working with them in the southern Red Sea at Bab el-Mandeb and in the Gulf of Aden. But we're not being effective, and so I think we'll have a chance later on to talk a little more about that. We also have to think, given the energy transition that we're undergoing, about other bodies of water. And the one that really strikes me as being most important and not talked about enough is through the Arctic. So there are some scientists that estimate that by 2030, in the summertime, there'll be ice-free transits available, either the Northwest Passage around Canada or the Northern Passage around Russia. And so given the fact that we are going to other places to find different sources of energy, the Navy has to be, and all navies have to be, limber enough and agile enough to be able to move to those in order to provide the kind of protections that's needed.
I think you've set a stage for us where we understand that these choke points, the energy transition won't necessarily alleviate our dependence on these choke points. As much as we can make an effort to begin to reshore, to offer some resiliency, right? But as far as the role of the United States, its partners and allies in securing the global economy, we'll need to think about these choke points thoughtfully. They'll continue to be an issue in our minds moving forward. When you look at the threat landscape right now, and I think I'll use this as a follow-up to you, Vice Admiral Miller, there are any number of global conflicts which are forcing us to be very, very thoughtful about any number of these choke points. We're having an escalation in the Middle East right now, it appears this week, where fears around the Strait of Hormuz abound, kind of tensions in that region. We still you mentioned the Arctic, our relationship with Russia following its unprovoked invasion of Ukraine has forced it to be a little more ambitious in the Arctic as it looks for places to send its LNG, et cetera. In your mind, how is the threat landscape right now reshaping where we should be prioritizing our attention on these global choke points?
Well, let's start. It's a great question, Reed. Let's start with what's happening down with the Houthis. I'll give you an example. Just last week, we had 3 U.S. Navy warships transiting the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. The Houthis fired about a dozen different cruise missiles and drones at these U.S. warships, and the U.S. warships were able to shoot down the ones that were actually headed to ships and ensure the other ones splashed harmlessly into the water. There was no response to that from the United States. There hasn't been a response yet. Right after that, the Houthis launched a ballistic missile into Tel Aviv. The following day, the Israelis struck, and it's quite a long round trip to do this via F-15s or other airplanes. They struck the port of Hodeidah, which is the primary supply point not only for the Houthis, but really for the country of Yemen. And so there was an immediate response to that. The current national defense strategy calls on us to conduct integrated deterrence, meaning we integrate at all levels of the government, diplomatically, economically, in the information space and militarily, but we also integrate with allies and partners. We're not doing that today in the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. So if we're going to deter anyone, then we have to be willing to have the capability, the credibility, and whoever it is we're trying to deter needs to understand that we have the desire and the willpower to actually respond to that. And so those are the things we need to do. If you look at what's happening in the Gulf right now, the Houthis basically control the Suez Canal and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. Thousands of ships go thousands of miles around Africa. On average, the price of going from Shanghai to Rotterdam is about 3.5 times what it was just last year. And so that's not really sustainable over time. More importantly, the Iranians can close the Strait of Hormuz, and they don't necessarily do that at the Strait. They could begin mining activities in the Arabian Gulf tomorrow, and we wouldn't know the mines were there in all likelihood until the first one blew up. So having a deterrent effect, we have a high number of ships and aircraft in the Gulf region right now. But if we're just willing to let them sail through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and defend themselves, that's not effective deterrence. And that's what we need to establish as long-term, and we have the strategy in place to support it.
So I think we've sufficiently covered. We care about these global choke points. We need an effective deterrent strategy in order to continue to protect them. But nonetheless, we would be wise as we move through energy transition to continue to explore these local resiliency measures that we can. And two ideas come to mind. One, we've talked about nearshoring, but Morgan, one of the other areas that you've mentioned, and you've done some writing for the Atlantic Council on this issue, is the idea of stockpiling. And we've mentioned this in earlier sessions, whether it's stockpiling critical componentry, but also when we think about stockpiling critical minerals, et cetera. Walk us through a little bit, what does stockpiling look like in practice, and how can it be beneficial to our resiliency goals, but also our nearshoring, friendshoring goals?
Yeah, thanks very much. I think as you think through security policy, it's become the case in the U.S. that everything is national security policy, and when you make everything under one definition, you lose the ability to focus in, and I think that's why it's so powerful what some of the DOE investments have done, because they're making targeted investments. In 2008, I wrote a book about energy security, and the second sentence of that book, or third sentence of that book, says we should be wary of relying too much on, Europe should be wary of relying too much on Russian natural gas. No one read that book, and it was published as an academic book. It cost too much money. But I think as we think through, what the book was about is about diversity of supply, diversity of demand, and so you can't just have it on the supply side again. Diversity of institutional responses, right? In energy, we often think of these things through hardware, software, and orgware. And if you miss the org, which is organizational, you have a hard time doing the other things. And so, yeah, of late, this idea of stockpiling for minerals has gained some political traction. Let's keep in mind that a lot of these things get their motivation not from some fancy mathematics or multi-optimization problems, but just because of politics. That's how the vast majority of policy gets done, right? And if you're under the impression, I say this to the fellows in the Veterans Advanced Program, if you're under the impression that we're just doing really great, elegant math and that's making policy, you're wrong. So it's something like 90% politics at least. And so why do we all of a sudden care about stockpiling critical minerals? Well, we care about it because it's politically attractive and it sounds really cool. We have an SPR for oil, as everyone most of the people in the room know, and it helped us a couple times. draw down and you use it economically or use it for security reasons. And so why don't we do that for critical minerals? So that idea has some legs, and we did write it up for the Atlantic Council a month ago, and then I wrote something else specifically about how China stockpiles, because that was not in the conversation. But of course, they're not, I guess this battle between the United States and China in DC, there's an impression that China is really happy that we've come to the notion that we have to do something on critical minerals and manufacturing and domestic onshoring, and they're just going to wait for us to catch up, and they're just happy about that. So that, of course, is wrong. They're moving at a faster pace than we are in these things, and they've had these things in place for, that dominance of the solar supply chain has been, you said 20 years, at least 20 years. But there's benefits too to it, right? The only reason solar photovoltaics are anywhere near the scale that Danielle just explained to us is why? Because the US did R&D in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Germany put up tariffs, great tariffs. Japan put up great tariffs. No, none of those reasons. It's just, at least the modern one, is because China made it cheap. And the quality is not bad either. So the quality is fine. The quality is as good as ours. That's why no one noticed that when you put up solar on your roof, there was a problem. It was just cheap and nice. And I think we have to hone in. So when we're talking about stockpiling, what do you want to stockpile? Do you care about the photovoltaic device, the solar panel on my roof, where it's made, or where the ignits came from, or where the wafers came from, where the cells came from? Or do you care about the photovoltaic device on a DoD satellite? So let's say we care about the DoD satellite more than the panel on my roof. So if you don't make the problem smaller in this case, then you can't do very much. Because if you had to somehow take all the sand you need and silver you need for a photovoltaic device, for my roof, you're going to be stockpiling more sand. It'll take up the entire continental United States. So I think there's a few things you could say about these stockpiles. One, you have to hone it in for some kind of mission critical thing. That's the first. And that means, again, I don't care what goes into I don't have one, but my Tesla's cockpit, but I do care what goes into an F-35 cockpit, the minerals and metals, and the systems. So there's a lot of hemming and hawing right now about the Chinese knowing everything about us if we let them drive our autonomous vehicles. Who cares if they know my data? But I do care if they know the data coming out of a fighter jet. And so let's hone down the system boundary for the stockpile. And the last thing I'll say on the stockpile is the analogy with energy is useful and instructive and incomplete. And so it's not the same thing. Again, we do not need rocks. We need processed goods. And sometimes those processed goods you can't keep for long periods of time. We've seen this kind of lesson in the SPR, the crude oil versus diesel and gasoline. So that's one thing. And we also, we need a secure one so the DoD can take X metal out of it and use it for those uses I've already said. But we also want to provide some sort of help or backup for the economics. So Julia's team is making all these great investments. Where can we sort of help support the market transparency, the market price stability, the market price discovery, the market fluidity, liquidity of those products with a stockpile? So I think it has to have those dual uses, and we just have to be careful about making everything trying to catch up with the Chinese.
I want to pull on three threads that you mentioned there when we think about this resiliency push. One is the precision of our understanding of the problem, whether that, we apply that to list making, stockpiling, et cetera. And so that's one piece I want to, Julia, I think the work that you're doing with kind of your analytical division is really, really important. But I think, Morgan, the other piece that you mentioned is this idea of how we make ourselves competitive vis-a-vis China's production of these goods. And a huge part of that, frankly, is capital inputs. And Danielle, I'm going to turn to you on this question because I'm going to fold in a question we have from the audience, Ben Byboth, which is one of the biggest capital inputs is the availability of energy and firm generation to power a nearshored manufacturing. We're in an environment where this year we've suddenly awoken to the fact that U.S. energy demand might be rising based on data centers and AI. At the same time, we're trying to bring back a lot more manufacturing. At Hanwha QCells, how are you thinking about this idea of energy availability, energy scarcity, energy prices as a capital input into your competitiveness overall?
Yeah, well, I think you certainly can't dispute that we have load growth in the U.S. for the first time, significant load growth for the first time in a long time. And I would say there's a lot of commentary about AI being a big driver for it. I would say electrification is the big driver for it. And we should not expect that that's going to change in the short term, given the benefits of electrified devices, whether it's in transportation or in the home, or in business or industry even. So it absolutely is a challenge if we want to onshore more manufacturing of any industry in any sector. We will need more power, and as the world electrifies, more of our power will be electric power. So I think every manufacturing sector, every growth area in the country will be challenged for getting firm, clean, reliable, low-cost power. So it's part of, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg when you think about it from a solar manufacturing perspective, because as I said earlier, if you have the ability to create a very low-cost, sustainable, relatively fast product, in terms of bringing it to market, leaving the gate of the factory and entering a field or a rooftop and being in service, this is the shortest cycle for any energy product that we have. So if you think about how do we grow fast, or how do you respond to a disaster, or how do you start creating more of that firm, clean, affordable, reliable energy, we're kind of right in the sweet spot for both of it. So it's a good problem to have, but I will not say it's trivial, because we still have to power our factories. We need to work with our local utilities and ensure that we have the power to fire those ingots. This is not an insignificant amount of heat and power that it takes to create these materials into manufactured products. So, there's not a really good answer except for to say that this is a good challenge to have. And we shouldn't expect that our competitors outside the U.S. are going to do anything less than try to keep ahead. When the IRA was a great shot in the arm for us here in the U.S. to invest and develop some of this manufacturing capability. But BNEF estimates that last year, China invested $80 billion in clean energy manufacturing, and that's 90% of the world's investment in clean energy manufacturing last year. So they're not expecting, we shouldn't sit back and expect they're going to let us catch up.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I think one of the things you mentioned is the availability of clean, firm generation. When we talk about a competitive industry vis-a-vis China, right? The relative emissions intensity of U.S. manufacturing when it is powered by clean, firm power is important, and creating a value in the marketplace for Hanwha's product that is powered by nuclear, powered by some of these clean energy technologies, is something we need to reward. Julia, I want to turn to you to kind of tackle both of these questions that I've teed up. One, how, when you, from a policy perspective, and when MESC is engaging in sort of deploying some of its programs into the field to support the reshoring, support the resiliency of U.S. manufacturing, how are you factoring in the availability of clean, firm power into that? And then secondly, I think I do want to give you the opportunity to talk about this idea of offering more precision to our understanding of supply chain risk.
Yeah, I'll start there, and I'd love to touch on stockpiling as well, given it comes in our focus. But I think first of all, we are trying to do some big, beautiful math around supply chains. These opportunities are knowable and measurable. We are looking not just at what is the available supply globally for the components, the critical minerals, the finished products that we need, but also how mature are the markets upstream and downstream of those products. And very importantly, can we extract, can we process, can we produce economically? And that is something that we're tracking very closely on a global level. If we take any supply chain segment, we're talking about lithium hydroxide, for example, essential salt within battery manufacturing. What are the assets globally that can produce that component, and at what unit cost and at what volume, and where do they sit in the world? And that is the kind of analysis that we need to do to understand what our gaps are to competitiveness and supply chain security, which does not mean the United States needs to dominate or needs to manufacture all of the product that it needs. However, it means we need to be in a position where we're not dependent on 90% of what we need from a single country or a single supplier. That is the definition of monopoly, and it is problematic even in a democratic economy. So we track very closely where those opportunities are, and then think about what level of investment is required from the public sector, from the private sector, and what kinds of policy measures do we need. And so we move from a world where a few bright folks sit in a room and say 10% sounds like a good tax credit to we can actually measure what we need and also for how long. And so that is something that is very important for us to build. To touch very briefly on stockpiling before we move over to firm clean power, I think what's important around stockpiling is to look more at the root cause for the discussion around this issue, and that is one where critical minerals right now are in an extremely volatile price environment. And so if you are a mining facility, an integrated processing facility looking to bring on new product in this space, it can be extremely challenging when the current incumbent globally, the PRC, is engaging in manipulative tactics, around product and price. And we're very much seeing that. We launched an RFI earlier this year to hear directly from industry and dimensionalize some of the challenge. And what we heard loud and clear is that it's even when there are committed investors at the table, bringing forward a new processing plant in the United States in these refined critical minerals sectors is very challenging, because there's no clear path forward to have a competitive price, because the global market price is so depressed by oversupply, and that poses significant challenges for validation, which can be a long and capital-intensive journey. But what we then think about in terms of solutions, so physical stockpiles, we know something about from the nuclear side of DOE and our colleagues at DoD who are stockpiling actively today critical minerals that are needed for defense applications, and we have a significant overlap in our energy critical minerals there. But it's not the only solution. And so there are also virtual or synthetic solutions around stockpiling, one of which is actually investing in circularity. And so of the $3 billion in critical minerals and battery investments that we announced a couple weeks ago, almost $1 billion of that was in circular infrastructure. So it may be possible that our greatest stockpile is sitting in our kitchen drawers at home, all of those used electronics. How do we get those back? We've already purchased them. They were processed in China. Most likely, how do we keep them here and continue to draw on them? And these products can be recycled thousands of times. We also have other policy measures to support on the demand side. I'll touch really quickly on clean, firm power. We recognize our team is directly catalyzing a lot of the manufacturing demand that is driving up the need for new electrons. And so we're working really closely with our colleagues at the Grid Deployment Office, also thinking about how we can support modernizing utility infrastructure and making sure that there's transmission for these clean energy projects, and that those can be powered by clean energy and batteries.
One thing you mentioned, thank you for addressing kind of the firm power demand, because that's been a consistent thread in the questions that we've gotten during this session, is how do you make sure that power gets delivered and built out quickly in order and at the pace that we want it to, at a pace that runs parallel with our manufacturing deployment goals as well. And then you also mentioned circularity, and that's its own resiliency tool, right? And while we're running out of time, I think there's plenty to be said about the ways in which policy can also incentivize circularity as a resiliency measure, both now but also in terms of developing a circular economy over the long term that have massive returns. Because we're running out of time, I want to quickly turn to each of our panelists one last time in order to offer some final reflections and thoughts. I think, Morgan, I might start with you. When we talk about the critical minerals, the natural resource base that is going to power energy transition and the economy moving forward for the next 50 years, there's a lot of fanaticism about the risks of that supply chain. How do we wrap our arms around this problem and have, I think something you've brought up a couple times, a little bit more of a precise, rational approach to improving our resiliency and making sure that these risks are addressed appropriately?
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing I'll say is we do have to be precise and specific about where the session's about national defense strategy. So let's be specific about the supply chains we care about for defense to start, and assume that if we get some of that right, it'll have benefits, as Admiral McGinn said, for the other parts of society. So we work, let's say someplace like Space Command cares about the supply chain for what happens on satellites, but also on Earth and the data centers they're working on. So let's be specific about what we're trying to solve. That sounds sort of cliche, but I think that to take it out of the high-level political discourse will make a big difference. And I would also say for those fellows of the Veterans Advanced Energy Project here that of all the departments, and I don't mean this pejoratively to DOE, I mean it positively to DOD, that the Department of Defense and the Pentagon has been, in my view, as an outside academic observer, the best at understanding that we have to work with partners, that portfolios and diversity in those portfolios matter. And they understand that intuitively, right? Because lives are at risk, and real sort of hard national security is at risk. And so I think the Pentagon is in the right place for understanding that, yes, we need to onshore some of this, but if we don't work with partners, we're going to be in a lot of trouble. And we see that in some of this, how do you determine this FEOC or the entities of concern or the FTA and where they match and who you can work with and who you can't. Because as the Vice Admiral Miller has said, you have to work in an integrated way. We're talking about something halfway around the world, and yes, we have a very powerful force over there, but working by ourselves is not gonna do the trick. So, thank you.
I'll come right down the panel, and we'll be very brief. I mean, part of this is what's next for policy. If this is a policy problem at Hanwha QCells, what do you need more from policy in order to make this happen? Very briefly.
Yeah. So briefly, I would say the IRA was a great foundation. More resources are needed to continue to support and encourage other companies to do what QCells is doing, for example, in solar. But as Admiral Ellis mentioned earlier, no one solution will be our answer. So I think continued support, long-term expectation of value creation, that's going to be what's needed to continue this trend.
Julia, I'll turn to you next. Last final comment on kind of where you see your office's role evolving because this will be a trend that will continue for some time.
Yeah, so we are going to continue focusing on partnering with the private sector to catalyze investment and on bringing analysis to drive clarity here. And I would say a last word, just particularly for the fellows, there are not only so many wonderful jobs that are being created by this series of investments that is happening, public and private, in clean energy in the U.S., but truly careers. And even as we look at the activities that we're carrying forward within MESC, that has very close ties to work and backgrounds in national security. We're running the analysis on the foreign entities of concern, and we're seeing a lot of private sector entities need to pick up the same type of work. So I think this background around energy and national security is going to be incredibly valuable going forward, public and private sector.
Vice Admiral Miller, any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I think from the military side, the military needs to be able to do, the Navy in particular needs to be able to do, is to carry out the National Defense Strategy and deter folks that want to challenge supply lines and choke points. And so as the world changes, our energy sources change, the Navy needs to change, the military needs to change as well. And so we require a great deal of adaptability. There is money in the current budget, there is money in the proposed budget for 2025 to make sure that we can do integrated defense or integrated deterrence in a way that we're supposed to be able to do it. But as the sources of energy, whether it's onshore, friendshore, or somewhere else in the world, the Navy needs to be there, the military needs to be at those choke points, making sure that they stay open so that we can continue the progress that we're making in energy transition.
Well, with that, I think we've run a bit late, but thank you to our panelists for joining us today. And let's give them a round of applause. All right, I think we're heading off that way. All right, and with that, it's my pleasure to welcome to the stage for our next session, Fortifying Critical Infrastructure Against Global Threats, Emily Domenech, who serves as Senior Vice President at Boundary Stone Partners. There, she leads engagement with the GOP for the firm. She also recently founded America Builds, a multi-industry coalition focused on enacting comprehensive permitting reform. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage for our next session.